Hey friends out there in YouTube land, today I want to talk about sensors, specifically sensors in the Panasonic HCX 1500 and that series of cameras. We're going to go over the CX10, specifically on the HCX350, the big brother to this. This will kind of tell you where things are going with the new HCX2 and HCX20, and we might even talk a little bit about Canon's XA60, 65, 70, and 75. So if you're ready to get into those kinds of things, let's jump into it. Friends, I'm going to share with you a lot of data that I've collected. I've been looking at sensor stuff to find out what sensors are in these cameras. Of course, Panasonic is very close-lipped about it. I'm going to give you a lot of information today. It may sound a little bit dry, but I think this is kind of on the nerdy technical side. You don't need any of it to operate the camera, but it's interesting to know and speculate. So everything I'm going to talk about here is speculation because Panasonic just doesn't make known directly. Also, in order to make it more fun, I'm going to go ahead and roll some footage that you haven't seen from an air show. People really like that on my last video that I did that had air show footage, and that'll be camera footage taken directly from this camera. And if we like it enough, I might even make some small videos about how that footage was captured and talk about grading it and just give you a better look at it in the future. If you like this type of video, it's a shame I even have to say it after 10 years. Look at that subscriber count, 7,600 people. Come on, guys, hit that like and subscribe button. It's that simple. You're watching this. A lot of you comment, and I talk to you, and you're not even subscribed, and I know it because it shows me that you're not subscribed. So if you leave a comment and I respond and you don't subscribe, man, that's half the social contract that you're bailing on. So please, subscribe. We're going to talk about these papers. You may not see them. I might put the footage directly over top of them, and if that happens, I'll leave the links down below so you can find out. First of all, let's talk about this camera. Why are we talking about Sony sensors? If I didn't say it before, we're talking about Sony sensors in a Panasonic camera. Well, the simple answer is because Panasonic doesn't make sensors anymore. They used to. They used to make quite a few, but they don't now. I believe that began winding down or spinning off in 2004 to 2005 and kind of finished directly in 2015 or 16, maybe even later. That's just on my best guess. And when we think about the sensors that could be in this camera and why that's important, it's only important for comparison so that we could know what could be coming down the road in the future and the things that Panasonic accepted about this camera that they may have been able to change to give us some upgrades. We're also going to talk about how that affects how we shoot with the camera, because when we know hard specs, we can work with it a little bit better. Today, we're also going to be talking about image sensitivity and saturation. That information is going to be given by Sony's specification sheets. They have a rule set that goes along with each one of these spec sheets as well, to kind of like a processor, the rules and that it can actually, the orders of the operations it can execute. They don't specifically say exactly what all those readout modes are and all those rules are. I'm not able to find that anywhere directly. So if you have a link to that or you know about that, send it and put a link down in the comments below. That'd be helpful. Okay. The final note is when we talk about the scores, the numbers of brightness and saturation and things like that, these are going to be benchmarks that Sony has done. I don't know what units they're actually measured in. They're just raw numbers. So we would only use them as a comparison from one to another. It doesn't mean candles, candela. It doesn't mean ISO. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means a raw benchmark, like an arbitrary number. But in this case, a benchmark number. And to talk about it, we need to talk about sensitivity and saturation. So lots of times people think about exposing to the right and, like how you create a bell curve on your histogram. That's really how we look at it. That's kind of like how you might ensure that your JPEG or the image that you're seeing is going to be properly exposed for print. But that's not what the raw image is capturing. It's a graphical representation of that. So when we talk about saturation, that's that bell-shaped curve or that exposed to the right or to the left, depending on what you're doing, your high key or your low key. When you talk about image or sensor saturation, that's talking about all the photo sites on the sensor and how much actual information, how many photons they can hold as they build an electrical charge based on how much light has hit them over whatever period of time until they can't hold anymore. Literally, Sony describes it as buckets being filled up like out in the rain. You can find that analogy pretty much anywhere. I think that's a really great way to determine or discuss it, and that's because it gets rid of the idea that we all have of exposure, and it talks about how well the sensor can handle light. It also tells some key characteristics of bloom and smearing, something that we notice specifically in small sensor cameras like camcorders. Even a large sensor camcorder is still a small sensor at 1 inch, which isn't even really an inch, but that's another story for another day. In any event, when you look at low light photography or videography with smaller sensored cameras, you usually see bloom, streaking, and smearing, and these things actually are directly related to image sensor saturation. So a lot of times we might think of smear as noise reduction. Well, it's interesting to know that smear, or that idea of smear, could actually come from bloomed or saturated sensors collecting too much light in their exposure time and not being able to jettison or discharge all of those photocells in time. If we haven't talked about that enough, don't worry, I won't talk about it anymore. If you made it through this part, great. If you didn't, then you're not hearing this. So if you did make it, just leave a thumbs up down below. Okay, so sensor. I believe that the sensor in this camera is the IMX317 CQC. And I believe it for a couple reasons. Number one, Sony only has a few smaller sensors in production currently, and at the time of production, they only had a few in production. At the time of production of this camera, the HCX350 series of cameras, and they only had one of them was 1/2.5 inches. Okay, so all the specs match what Panasonic says, specifically the readout modes for 60 frames a second 4K, in 10-bit, 422. It doesn't exactly say that right here. If you purchase it, you get a better chart, I suppose, but the download doesn't say it. However, all of the readout modes scan, they check out, and you even get 120 frames a second in the 1080p mode at 2.7 megapixel image up to 422 all eye. These things match right here. When we look at the chip size, when we look at the pixel pitch and stuff like that, then the sensor type and then the effective megapixels versus the total megapixels, they all match Panasonic specifications directly. Here's an important number. Let's talk about that sensitivity. At f5.6, you know Panasonic does not measure at f5.6 sensitivity. They measure their sensitivity at 1.5 lux, at f1.8, at 1/24th or 30th of frame exposure. Sony measures it differently at 5.6 at 1/30th of a second. And this is, of course, at its native ISO, which on this camera no one says, but I expect it to be around 800, between 600 and 800 on the camera. In any event, it doesn't say that, but it's assumed that it would be the base gain for this, which in this case would be zero gain. Anyways, the sensitivity is 1145, 1145, and saturation, when the sensor can't deal with any more light coming into it, is 3050, which sounds like a large number, but I have another photo over there. I have another one for a global shutter in the 1-inch category. In that global shutter with a much higher readout, much more expensive, can get into 30,000s, right? So 10 times as much, and that's a thing. Let's continue that with, we've got a couple of contenders. I want to move this conversation because the sensor that we talked about really just talked about this camera and the other 1/2.5 inch cameras that Panasonic has been making. Also, that sensor, the 317 CQC, the IMX 317 CQC, is a 2018 production sensor, and we see Panasonic coming out with their consumer line of HD and HX camcorders, the handheld palm quarters, using that 1/2.5 inch sensor. Interestingly enough, I do believe that they are both using this. So if you got the HV or the HX 971 or 870 or whatever, you would be getting the same sensor using a different instruction set, specifically an HD instruction set rather than the 4K instruction set. Those camcorders, all sharing the same sensor, can do quite a bit. Everything from HD at 60 frames a second, 120 frames a second, 8-bit, 10-bit. They can go to 4K at 10-bit. In fact, this sensor that's in this camera, according to Sony, in its readout mode number or 0, can do 4K 30 frames a second at 12-bit. Now, wouldn't that have been something had we gotten a 4K 12-bit option? Not RAW. Obviously, the sensor can read RAW, but we can't have RAW. Nikon just had a thing with Red about RAW and had a win outside of court because... Anyways, that's a thing. What if we could have RAW in this camera? Maybe we will soon. That's kind of interesting. Enough said about that. Let's move on to another camera. We got another camera, the camera that is the predecessor to this camera, the grandpa of the HCX2 and HCX20 right now, and that's the CX350. That camcorder is a full-size 1-inch type camera, and that's the word that got me thinking, 1-inch type camera. Panasonic says 1-inch type. Panasonic talks about the UX180 and the DV200 and the HCX1 and the UX90 as 1-inch cameras. But they talked about the CX350 as 1-inch type cameras, and no one ever really bothered it. It's been out for 3-4 years now, and it didn't even dawn on me. No one thought about that word type. And that got me thinking, type, Panasonic, they may have done it. I think that the sensor in the CX350 actually isn't a 1-inch sensor. I think it's the 1/1.7 inch, which isn't exactly 1 inch, right? And that's an important thing because that's going to tell us some information about that camera. All of its instruction sets seem to match the IMX 204 OKQC, 0KQC. So the IMX 204. And that includes everything from the 27 up to 36 decibels of gain with negative gain. That includes the 10-bit or 12-bit audio-digital converter, specifically the 10-bit. That includes the actual megapixels. This one matches the megapixels very well, specifically readout mode 2, 15.12 megapixels. It's actually a little bit larger sensor, going over 20 megapixels in some of its readout modes, but the instruction sets allow that frame size, that window size, to be adjusted based on the needs of the manufacturer or the OEM that's buying it. In this instance, readout mode number 2 and 2A both give modes in 15.2 megapixels with a screen size, a window size, a frame size that's just slightly larger than Cinema 4K. Now, if you take out that Cinema 4K size, you'll find 15.03. And that's exactly the size of effective megapixels in the CX350, right? And because of that, I believe that this IMX 204 is the sensor being used. Pretty cool stuff here. When we look at the sensor, we find out that it's got a little bit of a different brightness, right? The sensitivity at 5.6 is 969, which is less than good old-fashioned the CX10 or HCX 1500 or 2000, same as well as signal saturation. Also, a little bit less at 2855, 2855. And you might say to yourself, why is that? Why would it be different? Well, there's a difference in pixel pitch between the sensor, the 317 and the 204. And the 204 has a smaller pixel size, quite a bit smaller. And because it's got a smaller pixel size, that's going to affect its sensitivity. So although the resolution is higher, the sensitivity is lower because the pixel size, the pixel pitch is smaller. And that makes quite a bit of sense. Now, interestingly enough, Panasonic has gone ahead and published that the CX350 has 13.5 stops of dynamic range using their V-Log. So even with that smaller pixel pitch, very similar to people were concerned when the Sony A7R2 came out, right, with all those extra megapixels or whatever. They were worried that the more megapixels would make it worse in low light. It seems like it does on paper, but then the larger sensor, having a larger area, may make up for that in practical use. In any event, if you're not satisfied with that, because that's close, that's the one that I believe it is, that's why I brought it in here, but I also think that it could be the IMX 383. And this one's going to help you a little bit differently. This is a true 1-inch sensor that has multiple different modes. And in this instance, if they're using this mode, I believe, or this sensor, I believe they're using the type 1/1.06 inch sensor at a native resolution in that mode, in that readout mode of 17.25 megapixels, but once again brought down to 1684 when they're using their actual readout mode, 1 and 2 in. Those are the two modes that I believe where you'd be seeing the electronic image stabilization or the cropping of that advanced OIS Plus. So if you take into account the advanced OIS Plus, you can get back to that 15.03 or thereabouts pretty quickly with that crop and still having the Cinema 4K picture size that the CX350 does. There's also another mode. It's got, of course, all the other modes here as well. So it'll do the 60 frames a second 4K and 12-bit. This one also has the ability to do 60 frames or 125 frames a second at 12-bit in a is like a 2.5K, which could just as easily be brought down or used by the end user as a 1080p 120 frames a second mode in 10-bit. Of course, it has that instruction set as well. Now, when we look at this camera, this is where we actually see some increase. Oh, camera, sensor. When we look at this sensor, that's where we see some increase. Now, the increase at 5.6 sensitivity is 1663 compared to around 1100. And the saturation is 3665, 3665. So basically, 615 percentage points or points better than the Panasonic smaller guy, the CX10 or the 1500 or 2000. I think those are some important things to note just because all of them have several things in common. Number one, Panasonic does these things where they give out firmware releases, specifically a large firmware release at the end of life of a product. I think this is almost as a constant improvement thing that they do, similar to Fujifilm, although Fujifilm doesn't do it anymore. But Panasonic seems to like to pack future-proof software or hardware into their devices so they can constantly update them. Now, many manufacturers are probably doing that right now because this is what's available to them. So maybe Panasonic didn't want to push the envelope with 12-bit right now because that might bring about 12-bit before it was necessary. Maybe 10-bit's perfectly necessary. Who knows? It doesn't. I can't say for sure. But what I can say is that it leaves the opportunity available that if they come out with a new generation of cameras in 3 years that are 12-bit, they could upgrade these cameras because the sensor or the instruction sets are in them. For all of the sensors that we've talked about here. Now, that's going to conclude this part. I want to share something with you about Canon when we talk about sensors, but before I do that, make sure you leave a comment. Do you agree with what I've said? What do you think? Go check these things out. Let me know what you think. Does it really matter? I don't know that any of this matters. Once again, I said this was a video so that you could watch some airplane footage, airport footage, fighter jet footage, and hear nerdy stuff. That's what we're hearing. The next thing I want to say is Canon. Their XA 60, 65, 70, and 75, those cameras are using Canon sensors, and they are still 8-bit cameras internal. 10-bit output to HDMI, but 8-bit internal. Why in the world? Why in the world? I don't understand it. Now, 8-bit and 10-bit, there's a huge difference in the amount of colors that are in your workspace, but I just wanted to bring that up. If you've got a XA 60, 65, 70, or 75, just tell me a little bit about it. Share me some footage. Show me some skies and banding. And actually, the reality is, I don't know necessarily that 8-bit is all that important because, or 10-bit's all that important because even on this camera like you're watching right here, that's 8-bit right there, and it's looking great. I mean, it just looks good. So when properly exposed and things like that, there's a lot less need for correction. I do think that sometimes in some of these different colors that I have over here, an 8-bit image will show the banding, the steps a little bit differently. And I also know people sometimes sillily will say to me, to my videos, why you talk about video, but you've got banding on your background. Hey, brother, that's not me. That's got to be you, because when I record in 10-bit and stuff like that, I mean, if I record something and I've got banding that's visibly seen on my editing machine with my Precisionist monitor, I re-record it. I don't put it out there. So if you're seeing banding, that could be compression or data issues or something on your end or your viewing device. Lots of times I encode this stuff, you might even see when it turns on, so that it's DCI P3 or whatever, so that high resolution, high dynamic range stuff, just to give you guys a little bit of visual intrigue, or maybe just to play around with the technology. I don't know. In any event, I hope that you found this helpful. Guys, if you did, don't forget to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. I want to thank you for watching and remind you I'll catch you on the flip side. Bye for now.